bandwidth. And we're going to go in the order of the program.
Okay.
I don't remember if I mentioned that or not.
Yeah.
And Andy, you said, or in one of the official messages, the request was for the presenters to turn off their cameras also when they're not presenting. Is that right?
Yeah, so just for bandwidth purposes, it hasn't come up today on my stream as an issue at all. I mean, there's larger panels where there's going to be, I think, a lot of people probably on camera at the same time, and that could slow things down. But I think just for 3 of you, it'll probably be okay.
Okay.
If you want to stay on, you're certainly not obligated to.
Okay.
Okay, so as people are filtering in, just to go over the ground rules again, we have 3 papers being presented in this session on community corrections and policy. I'm going to still hold everybody to the 10-minute time limit, although with 3 papers, we have a little bit more wiggle room, and I don't have to be super, super strict. I'll still come on at 9 minutes if it doesn't look like you're wrapping up, just to sort of be the voice of God and say it's time to start wrapping up. You have 1 minute remaining. We'll save all questions for the end. So those of you in attendance, please post any questions you have for any of our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom. We're trying to avoid chat just to keep everything in one place, and it helps me keep track of everything. So that said, we're going to go in order of the program. So our first paper today is A Look Their Mother Would Give Them. So Abigail, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm just going to put this in present mode. Okay, so thanks for joining me here. Thanks to the organizers of the conference. Really great to hear that it's going well so far. I'm presenting to you today from Toronto. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. Before we get to the unpacking of my argument, I'm just going to give you some background on the research and the particular segment of the voluntary sector that I'm looking at. So in Canada, the youth justice law is nationalized, but it's operationalized by the provinces. So today I'll be talking to you about the most populous province, which is Ontario. In the interest of time, I'm not sharing too many passages from interviews or case notes, but that's what I did in my research. I talked to 25 people across the penal field. And as in most jurisdictions, the penal voluntary sector is heterogeneous in Ontario, but I'm not tending to that breadth of the PVS in this presentation. I'm talking here about a very narrow portion of the penal voluntary sector. And so these penal voluntary sector workers and their organizations, they receive referrals from the criminal justice system. So they run programs that are exclusive to youth in conflict with the law, receiving referrals from police, from the courts, from probation. And so they're very much framed, their work is very much framed by notions of punishment. I turn to Simmel's social type of the sociological stranger as a way of theorizing about the position the PVS has in the criminal justice system. This social type synthesizes elements of proximity and distance. The stranger is a social type that is able to adopt a perspective that is simultaneously that of an insider and an outsider. This involves the meeting of life worlds. So the penal voluntary sector, the PVS, is an element of the criminal justice system, but they're not a part of it. So here I'm really narrowing in on the relationship the PVS has with police, courts, probation, with a view that it informs PVS work. The meeting of life worlds unfolds in a dynamic way, and this positionality can be characterized along 3 dimensions. So spatially, temporally, and relationally. The argument for today is that spatial, temporal, and the social position of the PVS and PVS workers contribute to the special relational tasks that other groups could not easily complete. And so youth PBS work occurs in voluntary sector organizations, which can be separate from the criminal justice system. And it also occurs within the criminal justice system in state-run facilities, like carceral facilities. When PBS workers are in that criminal justice space, they're very much so guests in that space. Criminal justice workers rarely come to the PBS, but there's still this element that is dynamic. So from the PBS workers I spoke to have a wide range of roles and varying spatial relationships, from a PBS court worker that has planned and unplanned interaction with criminal justice actors in their frequent work in a courthouse, to anger management. Group facilitators have infrequent in-person contact, and they don't have very many unplanned interactions with the criminal justice system. Temporarily, while a young person can be on probation and be ordered to attend programming in the PBS organizations, they can do this sort of like concurrently. The interventions don't actually happen at the exact same time and space. Rather, it's sequential. The young person is referred from the criminal justice system to the penal voluntary sector, but the actual interventions don't generally happen at the same time and at the same space. So the usual sequence of events for most of the programs is police, courts, probations refer a young person to the PBS, and then the PBS sort of start their work. And there's this tandem arrangement between the criminal justice system and the PBS workers that work alongside them. They're coordinated, much like these brilliant young people in this GIF. They're coordinated, but they're working in their own space in their own time. There's this division of labor between them that both need to perform their tasks in order to do the work. And there's this delicate balance. This is the usual flow of PBS work in the criminal justice system, but sometimes the unusual can become unusual because it is a delicate balance. So sometimes this spatial and temporal distance between them collapses. And so I'll share a story. And this is a story of a very abrupt example. So this is an example provided by a PBS worker. She goes in, she receives a referral from probation to go and do an assessment at state carceral facility. She goes into the state carceral facility. She does all the things that she needs to get into this carceral facility. She goes into the room where she's meeting the young person. She starts asking some questions. She's gathering information. She's establishing rapport. And then all of a sudden the door opens, 3 guards come in yelling and screaming, and the young person is violently removed from the room. So they can sort of insert themselves. What happened here is the young person was suspected as having some contraband. And all of a sudden, what became the most important part of that process was the security concerns of the guards. So this assessment of a security threat disrupted the usual tandem arrangement. The PBS and the criminal justice system have different spatial and temporal rhythms, and there's boundaries between them, but they're actually quite porous. And so there's boundaries and there's this tandem relationship, but except when there's not. And so the PBS is an element of the criminal justice process, but they are also not a part of the criminal justice system. They are not police officers, probation officers, judges, but they are part of the same penal field because of that referral. This brings them socially, spatially, and temporally in the same field with the criminal justice system. This relationship is dynamic. It depends on the situation. It depends on the PBS relationship with the criminal justice system and young people. And what I'm going to spend my last few minutes talking about is how this positionality contributes to some of the special tasks and relationships that they have with young people. These special tasks are personalized approaches, a personal touch that is connected to a worker's professional experience or training, Here, the social, spatial, and temporal gap between the PBS and the referring criminal justice system plays a productive role and helps PBS workers to form distinctive relationships with their youth clients. I didn't talk to young people in my research, so I'm not sure if they observed this same gap, but this is in talking to PBS workers, and this gap helps them to have special relationships with young people in conflict with the law. So for example, they're able to help young people navigate the criminal justice system and spend time with young people that is not based on programming. The example I'm going to dive into a little bit more here is the racial subjectivity. So a distinction for some racialized PBS workers in this investigation is that they were interested in engaging in PBS work because of the overrepresentation of racialized youth in the statutory criminal justice system. These PBS workers are more likely to situate their work in the PBS as an act of resistance towards a punitive state that treats racialized youth harshly and unequally. For these PBS workers, their motivation to do the work comes from the personal observation of the harsh role of the criminal justice system based on their lived experiences. For them, working towards curtailing the harshness of the criminal justice system for racialized youth is a moral imperative. They attribute their racial identity as a motivation for their sense of ownership over solving problems. And so another story. So this one, a PBS worker sort of shared how this racial identity can close the distance between her and her clients. And here she's referencing sort of a look their mother could give them. It's a reference to their shared social cues and a certain embodiment of a shared language. Coming from a Black PBS worker, the statement imbues governance that is at once gendered and racialized. This shared identity should not obscure the very real social distance that this PBS worker has from her clients, but it also offers an entry point to consider how PBS workers embody their social identity into their PBS work. The vast majority of the time, this is copacetic. It works so well, you might be tempted to observe that this is the system working as it should, which is why it seems like one of the special tasks that the criminal justice system can't do. On a programming level,
Sorry, about 1 minute left.
Oh, thank you. The PBS is insulated from the criminal justice system. And so one last story is this story involves a PBS worker who's working at an attendance center, and she's running an anger management program. The curriculum is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and she mentioned Malcolm X, and she wasn't supposed to. So cognitive behavioral therapy does not involve Malcolm X. A young person mentioned this to their probation officer, and the probation officer ended up calling the PBS manager because they were concerned about the content of the curriculum. And so another example of a collapse. Now this collapse is a little different. They complained about the subversive narrative in the anger management, but here you have that there's this level of disruption, which emphasizes how the PBS is not sort of always sort of separate and distinct temporally and spatially from the criminal justice system. So just giving you sort of a very brief sort of introduction to my research, how the concept of a stranger can be also contribute to ways of understanding a perspective that is simultaneously that of an insider and an outsider. The stranger analysis enables an analysis that allows PBS workers to occupy specific discursive positions in the youth justice penal field. It isolates liminal spaces and specific forms of social interactions. These everyday arrangements and the moments when there's collapse provide an interesting entry point to examine these power relations. Of course, it's more complicated than that. And if you have any questions or you want to talk more, feel free to email me.
All right. Thank you so much. Our next paper is The Failure of Deinstitutionalization After Attica. Nicole, whenever you're ready.
All right. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy, and the other organizers. This was quite an undertaking, and it's really exciting to make these international connections or keep them going on even during COVID. Okay, so slightly different title, but more updated. All right. An uprising at New York's Attica prison demanding prisoners' rights was violently put down in September 1971. There was public outcry, debates about justice, and a short window in which institutional changes could be made that would otherwise be unthinkable. A pattern familiar to us definitely in 2020. Through strikes, manifestos, and uprisings in California and New York prisons from 70 to 71, predominantly Black activists had forced the untenability of incarceration into national discussions. These debates often centered on decarceration, the creation of mechanisms for people to live and receive services in communities rather than prisons. In the state of Wisconsin, we can see how the relationship between the community and corrections departments was being redefined in the process. And we can also see how public debates about the ideal role of the community aired officials' anxieties about African-American resistance, revealing a concern with making Black men easier to control. I've analyzed public discussions about the direction of corrections in Wisconsin in the early to mid 70s to learn how did members of the public and state government articulate their visions of the role of the community in corrections, and how did state policies change in response to public pressures. I'll especially draw from the findings of a task force created by Democratic Governor Patrick Lucey in 1970. He called members to, quote, challenge the propriety of institutionalizing certain types of offenders. I'll also draw on testimony from legislative hearings in Madison that reassessed reliance on prisons that were led by the US House in November of 71. This was 2 months after Attica, and just after a couple of other incidents in Wisconsin, including an uprising at Wisconsin's Green Bay Reformatory in response to guards beating inmates. I'll also draw on discussions about decarceration in the press. In these debates, I've located many arguments about humaneness, democratizing corrections, cost, and the right of people to live in the community, and the potential effectiveness of community organizations compared to the state, especially through cultural competency. But one consideration is especially striking: the idea that civic organizations would be more effective at controlling Black men who might riot either inside of prisons or outside of them. The director of the Wisconsin Division of Corrections in 1971, Sanger Powers, implied that Black anti-prison organizing was to blame for the killings at Attica and not state violence. And we know from the historical record, it was certainly state violence that was responsible for the scores of killings. He stated in 71, seldom does one read, this is a quote, how much more difficult the offender is to handle than he was just a few years ago. How somehow or other, many of them have snowed themselves into believing that they are political prisoners. The account subtly references the political consciousness of Black Panthers and authors of prison manifestos in California and New York. Powers articulated concerns specifically about Black men's potential to rebel when he was interviewed by the Wisconsin State Journal for this piece, Waupun Revolt, called Improbable, Waupun being one of the largest men's prisons in Wisconsin at the time. So this piece was designed to dissuade the public that there was a chance of a revolt in Waupun, like in Attica. Powers cited the race and ethnic composition of the incarcerated men and guards. He commented on, quote, feelings of persecution of the large Black population at Attica. The Black prisoner at Waupun, he said, with a few conspicuous exceptions, this is a quote, continues to be a fairly tractable inmate with whom we would not expect trouble just because he was Black. His assurances still reveal an underlying anxiety about Black political awareness and the violent ends to which it could lead. So how could riots be prevented? As part of explaining what he called very helpful programs in Wisconsin compared to Attica, Director Powers cites a group called the Commandos, which he said offer prisoners the opportunity to talk to someone with their grievances. So who were the Commandos? They were initially members of the NAACP Youth Council in Milwaukee, who had protected well-known civil rights leader Father Gropey during the open housing marches from 67 to 68, 200 days in support of desegregating housing in Milwaukee. In March of '68, the Kenosha News wrote that the head of a Black civil rights organization in Milwaukee, the Urban League, had recommended that the commandos, quote, should be used to help keep order in the inner city because they really patrol the neighborhood. With the uprising in Milwaukee in the summer of '67 fresh in readers' minds, he noted that the group is, quote, well respected in the Negro area and could be a big help in preventing disorder. And in '68, the commandos first received funding to do social service work with youth of the inner core of Milwaukee. The Wisconsin legislature had made these funds available after various uprisings of the '60s. By then, the commandos were an independent organization primarily composed of formerly incarcerated Black men and women. And they were especially interested in work with youth coming out of juvenile correctional facilities, especially the one called Wales. So community organizations became appealing to officials and others at a time when officials feared they had lost control of Black men. A limited form of decarceration did develop out of these discussions in the early '70s, but it did not involve closing prisons. It actually involved privatization, a novel idea in social services provision. In '72, Governor Lucey's task force, which was led by a Pepsi executive, proposed a purchase of service system to deliver correctional services to people on supervision in the community rather than in prisons. This plan was then passed in the legislature in '72 at a time when the state anticipated a declining prison population. '73 to '74 was the first fiscal year where the funds were operational, and there were $750,000 that went to community groups that year to fund programs like halfway houses and drug treatment. The program grew, and it even continued when the prison population began to increase in the late '70s. But rather than serve as a tool of abolition or wide-scale deinstitutionalization, the POS system, purchase of service system, quickly became part of an agency that built new prisons at record speed, and it eliminated parole altogether. And anxieties about prisons as inherently dangerous to the social order remained. Out of the ideas established in the early '70s, what is most lasting is the idea that the community should be used as a vendor for social service delivery. So it might be tempting to see Wisconsin's purchase of service program as a case for neoliberalism. That is the state's restructuring of how social services are delivered to resemble market disciplines. But it didn't start out that way. Cost was not the major thread of critique in these early discussions in the 1970s, and it was even used as a counter argument to decarceration by the prison guard unions. And the effort to make Black men tractable came before the extension of neoliberal norms and the disinvestment that followed. By experimenting with decarceration, Wisconsin did make significant changes to correctional and bureaucratic practices. So in this sense, the privatization of community correction services may be Attica's legacy in Wisconsin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. Our final paper this afternoon, a study of drug testing practices in probation. Jessica, you're here. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hope everyone can see my screen.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Okay. I'm Jessica Reichert. I'm acting research director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. ICJA is a state government agency based in Chicago. And this presentation draws from a series of 2 articles available on the ICJA website. One is a literature review of drug testing, which provides some background information for today. And the other is a study of drug testing practices in the state. So drug testing is a very common practice in probation, but the limited research available offers no conclusive evidence that drug testing alone reduces recidivism or improves behavioral health outcomes. So Holloway and colleagues conducted a meta-analysis on drug treatment effects on criminal offending, and the authors reviewed 4 studies on drug testing and found there were no effects on reducing criminal behavior. And in a 2014 systematic review of the use of drug testing for medical management of patients, Dupuy and colleagues found no clinical value in drug testing among the limited studies that were available. So positive drug tests may equal negative consequences, and these may include sanctions, technical violations, and revocations. There is a lack of guidance on drug testing. The American Probation and Parole Association last offered guidelines on drug testing in 1992. And ASAM, the premier association for addiction medicine professionals, developed clinical guidelines for drug testing in 2017, which should be generally in line with non-clinical probation practices. To develop the guidelines, ASAM analyzed more than 100 studies and incorporated the views of multidisciplinary experts and scientific evidence. And in 2017, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals Adult Drug Court Best Practice Standards offered some guidance on the practice of drug testing, specifically for drug court supervision. So the ASAM guidelines specifically point out that drug tests should support an individual's recovery and not be used to punish them. So the literature suggests that rather than test all clients, probation officers should ask these questions. Why am I testing, and what questions will the test answer for me? In order to best detect drug use, random testing should be employed rather than on a predictable schedule, which makes sense. And if you test 1 time per week, it would yield a 35% chance of detecting drug use, while 2 times per week, an 80% chance of detection. So random testing and more frequent testing will get you more chances of detection, but of course, testing, the more you test, the more the costs increase. So overall, the recommendations from the literature is that there should be regular communication between treatment providers and probation officers, dialogue between the person conducting the test and the person taking it, awareness by all parties of the drug testing policies and procedures, including what potential sanctions might be, avoiding solely focusing on negative behavior and sanctions, but also focus on positive behavior and positive reinforcement and rewards. And also use drug testing as a tool for supporting recovery rather than exacting punishment. So now I'm going to discuss the findings from the study. That was just a little bit of background. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, ICJ researchers Lauren Weisner and Doug Otto. So we conducted an online survey just last year, and although it wasn't that long ago, I know that a lot has happened and changed to affect probation practices, including drug testing, that there's less drug testing going on, but it is assumed that after the pandemic is under control, more drug testing will resume in pre-COVID ways. So we randomly sampled 50 county probation departments. We used a stratified random sampling strategy. And we looked at different regions of the state and varying caseload sizes, with small, medium, or large caseloads in the county. We asked 60 questions about demographics, policies and procedures, the extent of drug testing, administration of tests, test types, and results and responses. We ended up having an 84% response rate, so 38 out of the 50 we were targeting. 95% of the respondents indicated that drug testing was a part of the probation officer's job description, and 79% noted that it was a mandatory duty. 87% indicated probation officers determined the drugs for which their clients would be tested, and 32% said a judge actually made the determination. So in terms of frequencies of tests, probation departments drug tested between 45% and actually some said 100% of their clients. 2/3 indicated between 80% and 100% of probationers were drug tested each year. 3/4 of respondents indicated 10 to 40% of their probation officers' time was spent administering drug tests. So a lot of time is done doing this. In terms of random tests, as you can see in the figure here, over half said most of the time was random. 60% of probation directors reported clients were expected to take time off of work to provide a sample for their drug tests, and over half said their clients have some trouble getting time off work to take drug tests. This figure shows ways drug tests are tampered with, and most often overhydrating and urine substitution. This figure shows the common drugs detected: marijuana, opiates, amphetamines, cocaine. Respondents reported the average price of a drug test was $8. So as seen in the figure, almost all respondents indicated their departments addressed initial positive tests and sporadic positive tests through discussion with their clients. And almost all continuous positive drug tests were addressed through a petition to revoke probation. 92% of probation departments responded to negative test results with praise. 39% offered rewards, which included such things as vouchers or gift cards, reducing the number of court appearances, or moving to less restrictive probation phases. So some recommendations here. Only 19% of probation departments always use random drug testing, which is recommended, and 25% never or sometimes use them. So random testing is the best method for detecting drug use. Clinical addiction experts recommend randomly selecting the length of intervals to control the time between the tests, and probation officers should use drug testing to inform treatment guidance to greatly improve the efficacy of treatment and using the random drug schedule. Though drug testing is recommended as a method for guiding treatment, survey findings indicated in our sample an increased use of petitions to revoke probation following continuous positive drug tests results compared to the initial ones. This indicates a reliance on more punitive measures in response to at least continued drug use. The practice helps avoid you should help avoid fostering us versus them mentality that could threaten the cooperative aspect of drug testing. Prior research shows that patients who respond positively to drug testing view it as a treatment component and a way to guide the treatment process. And by avoiding punitive responses to drug testing, probation officers can focus on treatment and motivating clients toward positive behavior change. And mention contingency management, which is a form of operant conditioning that emphasizes rewarding good behavior. And prior research has found significant evidence that contingency management interventions can effectively reduce positive drug test results. And here's just some references and my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. We have some time for questions. If anybody has any, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box. So we'll wait a minute or two to see if any questions come in. If not, then we'll be out of here early.
Abigail, I thought there were some interesting connections between one of your last examples regarding Malcolm X being used by, I think it was a program facilitator, and how that was punished, and some of the themes I was bringing out.
Abigail, you're muted.
Sorry, my mute was on. I also thought that there was a lot of connections with, you know, how community-based organizations are seen, and how sometimes they, you know, get into the penal field in one way and they end up in another way. So that's sort of what I'm finding in my research as well.
So a couple of questions have just come in. So for Jessica, can you give examples on how to promote non-punitive reactions to positive drug testing?
Yeah, like I mentioned, sort of in the recommendations, is that it should be a conversation when there's a positive drug test, about what's going on, why it happened. Yeah, more of a discussion than I'm trying to catch you, or you're just exhibiting signs of your substance use disorder and I'm going to punish you for it. And then on the flip side, also when there are negative drug tests, which is a good thing, offering those positive, incentives and reinforcement. And I provided some of those examples. I mean, some people give gift cards, some people just give praise, which is enough and free. So I just think those things appear to be, from the literature, a better way to address these positive drug tests.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Nicole. What do you think some of the implications of what you are finding are for current prison reform strategies?
Thanks, Dr. Kate, the person who asked the question. Yeah, so this was an opportunity that was really squandered. I mean, there were some changes that came out of this that are durable and lasting in their own right, for sure. But in terms of pressures from the abolitionist community, from within prisons and outside prisons, and other prison reformers at the time, these were incredibly modest changes. And part of the problem was that they severed sentencing reform from privatization. So the demands of reformers and abolitionists were about taking away indeterminate sentencing and giving people a right to live in the community once the minimum term of their sentence had been completed, or at all, ending prisons completely, depending on who was speaking. And also giving people who are incarcerated a right to asylum if they were political prisoners, as many of them understood themselves in the radical movement within Attica, San Quentin, and Folsom. Okay, so sentencing reform was severed from these modest changes about how the community would be treated, and that was one technical problem. And then another is how privatization was implemented in a way that became so bureaucratized within a few years. So part of what I've been doing is following the administrative and legislative documents that go along with these through the 70s and then 80s and 90s. And the requirements for community organizations to be paid for this work becomes so difficult to meet and complex that it really shut out the community from any meaningful discussion about how corrections would look. And it also meant that only a few large community organizations could carry out these services. So even the commandos within a couple of decades shut down and wasn't able to participate as an organization in getting paid under Reagan's social policies. So part of the problem was shutting out the community except for a few designated representatives. And then part of it was just a technical issue of taking sentencing reform as a separate issue. There were a few problems. As for policing policy, Sarah, were you thinking about policing policy in particular or criminal justice reform overall right now? I don't know if you're allowed to speak. I guess not.
Yeah, sorry, we have attendees, but I'm the president. I can do this.
I think
Um,
Sarah commented that she's interested in prison reforms overall.
Okay.
Yeah, but either would be very interesting. That was really helpful, your explanation so far.
Awesome. Thank you. So a follow-up, Jessica, from I'm sorry, I'm bad at assigning names or giving credit or attribution to questions. I believe this is Andrew Gonzalez, asking follow-up if possible. Another way to ask: are there recidivism and/or financial impacts to changing the way parole officers react to positive drug tests? Wondering what incentives to change policies exist.
That's a good question. And, my specific study was looking at the sort of landscape of what people do. And with that, looking at what the literature suggests to compare how current practices are to what best practices are. I'm not sure the answer to that. I think that would be a good area of study to actually look at either a department doing things in different ways that could be compared and look at the long-term outcomes. Off the top of my head, I can't cite anything right now, but that would be good to know, because then things that I was suggesting can have more weight to it, that these things are actually going to reduce recidivism as well as just give better other outcomes, behavioral health outcomes.
Great, thank you. So we have one more question that snuck in. What can people do to actually reduce the amount of prisoners in the prison system and not just divert the prison population from public to private prisons? By this, I mean that what I understood from the presentation, it seems like people diverted the prison population from the public prisons to the private prisons. I'm not sure who this question is for, Angeli. But I guess I invite the panel to consider this. I think this is probably for you, Nicole.
Okay, so yeah, I think that ambiguity about what the community was going to do is enormous. At this time, really, there were 7 or 8 types of proposals for what role the community would have if prisons shut down altogether, if a few prisons were to close, or if prisons were to be maintained, but the community were to have a greater role in working with people. So there were a few community-based, I guess you could call them prisons, and later they were reclassified to be prisons. So community-based facilities that the state ran that opened around this time. And so they were smaller and more transitional. But mostly what I'm talking about is not prisons at all. So organizations, community groups that either have an office or operate out of a center where a few groups run. And they deliver some kind of services to people who are leaving prison or under some kind of correctional supervision. And then the people who are receiving these services, the people live in their own homes, or they live with family members or in a shelter or somewhere else. So it's not a prison, it's an alternative to a prison where people are receiving some kind of correctional supervision, but they're also getting services from community groups. So it accompanied a few pushes from the governor to shut down prisons, and those pushes were only partly successful. So the governor wanted to shut down Green Bay Reformatory, which had a lot of younger people in it. And so what ended up happening within a couple of years was they moved all the younger people to other prisons and just reclassified it as an adult maximum security prison. So that wasn't successful. And then he also wanted to sell off this prison that was under construction for youth. And it had 500 beds, and it was sold to the federal government as a prison that's still operating. So the efforts to shut down prisons were unsuccessful. Really, just what was going on is pushing responsibility from the state to community groups to deal with people when they were released from prison.
All right, thank you. So not hearing any other questions, I'm going to again thank everybody for taking time to come and present their work with us today. Fantastic job, everyone. And thank you to everybody in attendance for your participation today. Hey, if you plan on sticking around on this stream for the policy issues panel at 3 o'clock Eastern, for recording purposes, I have to shut down the webinar and then restart it. So please feel free to log back in around 3 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy CrimCon.
Thank you.